Good day. Today, 6th August 2023, we're now well into the third month of Ukraine's counteroffensive. And the news continues to pile up about the fact that the counteroffensive is at a standstill and that Ukraine is not making any progress on any front. There were reports yesterday, which I touched on in my previous program, in which I spoke about the fact that there appeared to be another attack by Ukrainian forces pushing south of Orekhov towards Rabotino, another attempt to capture Rabotino, which, by the way, just to reiterate, is a village north of the major Russian fortified lines, the so-called Surovikin line. Anyway, I was skeptical that this attack, apparently carried out once more by light infantry, would get through, and apparently it didn't. It was once again repelled with very heavy losses. And there was another attempt yesterday, apparently, by Ukrainian forces to try to restart their offensive in the Vremevka ledge area along this long winding road. They tried to push beyond Staromayorsk in order to try to capture the next village. The attack again seems to have been unsuccessful, and there was a rather strange, curious account of the fighting by Alexander Khodakovsky, the head of the Vostok unit of the Donetsk militia, in which he described how one of the tanks that was utilized in this attack, Ukrainian tanks, actually was hit by a Russian anti-tank weapon and slipped under the water in a nearby stream. It's an odd story, but anyway, whatever. The important point is that the attack was unsuccessful. And now there's been further reports, a report in the Wall Street Journal, that the Ukrainian offensive towards Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, is now also at a standstill. And I'm not going to read the article. It is behind a paywall. But the title says, Ukraine struggles to retake Bakhmut from dogged Russian fighters. Notice how Russian fighters, Russian soldiers, have gone from being demoralized, corrupt, incompetent, badly led, inefficient, cowardly, all those many things that we were reading about earlier in the war. They've now suddenly become dogged fighters. And the subtitle says that Kiev's frontline soldiers describe a stalling counteroffensive against forces determined to hold pivotal city. And then the article goes on to discuss how the Ukrainian forces in and around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, that the force there has become exhausted, that they don't have enough equipment to break through, and it doesn't go into great details about the fighting, but reports I've actually seen suggest that it is actually the Russians now who have regained the initiative in this area, and that they might actually be pushing the Ukrainians back in several places. And certainly Klesheyevka, that village which seems to have become the focus of Ukraine's offensive in the Bakhmut area, Ukraine has been unable to retake, and I get the sense that the Russians either still occupy it or at any rate control it, and have been pushing on to some extent beyond it. So there we go. Stalled counteroffensive on every front. No sign that Ukraine is making any progress. Large numbers of casualties. I've discussed that in many places. And the Russian ambassador to London recently said in a program that, in an interview that he gave, that sooner or later the British government would have to finally and publicly acknowledge that Ukraine's offensive, which the British have so volubly supported, that offensive has in effect failed. Now, coming back to that report about the Ukrainian troops, the Ukrainian forces having exhausted their capacities in the Bakhmut area, from the Wall Street Journal, I noticed that in one of her many briefings, the Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, actually used the word tired to describe Ukrainian troops on the northern fronts, the area where the Russians seem to be making progress. Now, again, there's been actually less news about this. I gather that Ukraine attempted to launch some counterattacks there, but the Russian Defense Ministry yesterday announced that a village, I believe it's called Novoselovska, has now been captured by the Russian forces. I'm not sure what the military significance of this particular village is, or where it is exactly in terms of the front lines and what this portends. But anyway, it does seem that the Russians are making advances, and from what I can understand, this isn't a case like Klesheyevka and Staromayorsk and Pyatikhatki, which the Ukrainians have at various times claimed to have captured, or at least, if not the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which Ukrainian reporters at various times claimed that Ukraine has captured. It isn't like that in this case. The Russians are in physical control of this village and are pushing beyond it. But as I said, I'm not going to try and guess or work out exactly what this means in military terms. Suffice to say that the Russians do seem to be still pushing forward along the northern fronts. And I think we can talk here in the northern fronts about fighting in three areas near the town of Liman, Krasny Liman, which the Russians captured in the spring, early summer of last year, in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area, or perhaps one shouldn't use that expression anymore, but from Svatovo-Kremenaya towards the Oskol River, and further north towards Kupiansk. And I've discussed recently how there's been some discussion in Russian websites and commentaries from Russian reporters about a possible Russian advance to capture Kupiansk itself, which may suggest that the Russians are now seriously thinking about storming this town. Then we'll have to wait and see what they do decide to do. But it's interesting to see that Maliar, Ukraine's deputy defense minister, has now acknowledged that the Ukrainian troops in this particular area are becoming exhausted. And I've discussed also in previous programs how Ukraine has responded to all of this by trying to escalate drone attacks on Moscow, those seaborne drone attacks against Russian installations, the Kerch Bridge, those two ships that took place yesterday, a couple of days ago, rather, the day before yesterday, the attack on Novorossiysk, which damaged a Russian landing ship, and a further attack in the Kerch area, which damaged a small Russian tanker. Now, I wanted to just say something about that last attack, because I was very uncertain yesterday about what the rationale of the attack on the tanker would be, and I did wonder about the technical complexities of using a drone to try and attack a ship. Well, I've now seen footage actually provided by Ukraine, which shows the camera, taken from the camera on the drone, and it's absolutely clear that Ukraine intentionally attacked this tanker. That I think is now indisputable. And it's been widely suggested that Ukraine knew its whereabouts. It was apparently essentially at anchor, that they knew its whereabouts because they'd been provided with intelligence about its whereabouts by the Western NATO intelligence agencies. And I'm going to say straight away that I don't personally see how else Ukraine would know about the particular presence, location of this tanker. Small tanker, it's 8,500 tons. It's absolutely not a super tanker or anything like that. So we're not talking about a big ship there. It's been sanctioned by Western governments because it's played a role in supplying oil to Syria, breaching unilateral Western sanctions on Syria, which of course are not recognized by Russia or by most of the rest of the world. I doubt that Ukraine would be able to acquire human intelligence to track the whereabouts of a single tanker. I mean, surely if Ukraine does have spies, which of course it does, in southern Russia, I would have thought they would have more important things to do than to try to find the whereabouts of a single tanker. And Ukraine does, I believe, have some satellite intelligence of its own, but I gather not on a very extensive scale. And it is universally known that it relies heavily on Western intelligence gathering to provide it with up-to-date intelligence of what is going on in the conflict zone. So it seems to me logically that someone must have tipped Ukraine off about the presence of this tanker and helped direct this drone to attack this particular tanker. And as to the reason why this was done, I'm going to come back to what I said previously. I think this is all very, very much connected with strenuous Western efforts backed by Turkey to try to get the grain deal resumed. The cancellation of the grain deal has deprived Ukraine of a vital source of export revenue, so making Ukraine even more dependent economically on the West. But more importantly, it does threaten to increase pressure on food prices in Europe, though probably not globally, in a way that would be uncomfortable for West European or European governments at a time when inflation in many European countries, including Germany and, by the way, Britain, remains high. So there is this desperate effort to try to strong-arm the Russians back into joining the grain deal. And I've previously discussed how it's somewhat mysterious to me also how Ukraine is able to launch these drones, given the attacks by the Russians on Ukrainian ports, which partly were intended specifically to interrupt, to stop these drone attacks from taking place, and that it might be that there was speculation. In fact, I received an email from someone, I'm not going to disclose anything about them, but somebody who understands and knows about these things, who suggested that the ultimate place from which these drone attacks are being prepared is NATO territory, Romania, Bulgaria, and of course we can't completely discount even the possibility that Turkey, which is also anxious to get the grain deal up and running again, even conceivably Turkey as well. And it's important to remember that Turkey, of course, continues to be a member of NATO. So what we see presumably, are these attacks by drones on Russian merchant shipping, on a Russian port, Novorossiysk, on Russian warships with drones, perhaps connected or based from NATO territory in some way, and using NATO intelligence assets, satellite data, drone data, and that kind of thing. And I said that this is an incredibly dangerous and reckless game, and there is a real risk that rather than be intimidated by this sort of thing, the Russians will instead respond by starting to take action against Western intelligence gathering assets, specifically drones, NATO drones, and even perhaps surveillance aircraft in this particular area. I understand, for example, that the US Global Hawk drone has been regularly used in this area, and it would be rather a dramatic escalation if the Russians retaliated by bringing one down. So anyway, we will see what happens, but I've changed my view. I thought yesterday it might have been an accidental strike on this tanker, but I hardly think so anymore. And I would add that it's obvious to me that this attack, at least, must have been carried out with Western involvement. And by the way, the small size of the tanker, the fact that it was empty, it was an attempt to provide some kind of a warning to the Russians or a pinprick towards the Russians. That would then make sense of this attack, rather than going up against a fully laden Russian tanker, which might not only be much more likely to trigger Russian escalation, but which might conceivably have a further upward effect on oil prices. So I want to stress this is all speculation. No doubt some people will come back and say that what I'm saying isn't likely to be true. I don't think one can exclude it, but they'll say that it isn't likely to be true. No Western government will, of course, admit to being involved in this attack. But it does seem that where the grain deal is concerned, Western governments are alarmed about Russia's decision to cancel it. And can I say on that front that I've started to get a sense that this has gone beyond just rhetoric, propaganda rhetoric, about the effect on poor countries and all of that. They are generally concerned about the fact that supplies of Ukrainian food to Europe are now ending, and I suspect that this is what lies behind these particular attacks. Before I finish on this particular topic of the grain deal, there's been certain comments. The Turkish government continues to say that they're working to try to find some means of reviving the grain deal in its original form. Well, we'll see what that achieves and whether Putin is prepared to discuss that with Erdogan when they meet, whenever that is. So that's one thing. But perhaps the other most striking thing is that Josep Borrell, Europe's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, has been very, very busy getting increasingly agitated and angry about this and writing all kinds of articles and pieces and making all kinds of statements, warning African countries particularly about getting too close to the Russians. He's talked about the Russians practicing some form of imperialism in Africa. I'm going to say I think that was extremely ill-advised comment, given that, of course, the major colonial powers in Africa were European countries, including Spain, which is, of course, Borrell's home country. They also had colonies in Africa. So I don't think that will be particularly well received by many people in Africa. But one thing particularly stood out was that he seemed to be warning African states about these Russian offers of free grain. Putin has spoken about the fact that in the case of certain African countries, which are going through particularly hard economic conditions, Russia is prepared to supply tens of thousands of tons of grain entirely for free. Not, by the way, a vast amount of grain, but perhaps enough to take some of the edge off in these particular countries. Anyway, Borrell seems to be warning African states against this, and I'm not entirely sure what he thinks they're supposed to do. Are they supposed to reject this free grain that they're being offered? Does he prefer that shortages in these countries, food shortages in these countries, continue and even escalate? Or is he thinking that African states should do something else? It does seem to me rather difficult to understand exactly what point it is that Borrell is making. But all I will say is that that's up to him. It's typical of Borrell to make these emotional and angry comments about anything related to Russia nowadays. But I doubt that the African states that are being offered this free grain will refuse it simply because Borrell is telling them to. I mean, we have an expression in England about looking a gift horse in the mouth, and I would have thought that countries that are short of food are going to accept free offers of free food from wherever it comes. Some of these countries, Zimbabwe incidentally being one of them, appear to be pretty friendly to Russia in any event. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. I don't think one should devote too much time to talking about Mr. Borrell and his really, I find, increasingly eccentric statements. So anyway, so that's probably what lies behind these attacks on the Russian installations in the Black Sea. And by the way, the Turks, in trying to revive the grain deal, are even to some extent giving the game away. I read a report somewhere that Turkey is saying that their concern is to stabilize the situation in the Black Sea, without, of course, saying who exactly is destabilizing the situation in the Black Sea, which, of course, makes it seem increasingly to me that this is indeed an attempt to put pressure on the Russians with these pinprick attacks in order to force them to go back into the grain deal. Now, what the Russians will do in response, I have no idea, but my own guess is that the Russian military are strongly opposed to a revival of the grain deal, and I suspect that Putin himself will be inclined to follow their views on this issue. I also get the sense that he feels personally deeply aggrieved by the way in which he feels that Russia was strung along by the West over the grain deal. And I personally think it unlikely that he will consider re-entering the grain deal. I think what he's much more likely to do is to authorize the Russian military to take further steps, to ensure that Russian shipping and Russian installations are protected from these drones. And I suspect that there is a lot that can be done in that regard, which hasn't been done up to now. And I suspect beyond that, that inevitably there will be pressure on Putin to launch some kind of retaliation against any Western powers that are involved. But I suspect Putin, in his usual careful, cautious way, will be resisting that pressure, because the one thing that has been consistent in his actions up to this time is that he resists pressure towards uncontrolled escalation. Anyway, there are lots of rumours and discussions about other things, and of course Ukraine does launch attacks in various places. There's talk about vast drone fleets being prepared by Ukraine to attack Moscow, that Ukraine is trying to put together a force of around 1,000 drones or something like that to attack Moscow all at once and at one time. There's reports, I think it was in the New York Times, that Ukraine has now understood better the defences of Moscow from these isolated drone attacks, which we have seen, and that they are therefore in a better position to launch this overwhelming drone attack. By the way, a couple of months ago, I was hearing exactly the same claimed about Crimea, that the Ukrainians would launch a massive attack with thousands of drones upon Crimea as part of their offensive. It hasn't happened. And of course, if you're really going to do something like this on this kind of scale, it's very strange, again, to talk about it to the American media in advance and to have it discussed there. Now, on this particular issue, I would simply say that, of course, if it's one thing to send 5 or 6 drones across the vastness of Russian territory, moving towards Moscow, drones in that quantity probably would not be detected. But if you're going to send 1,000, even from multiple directions, I can't imagine that the Russian surveillance systems won't detect these big drone swarms probably days before they reach Moscow. And I would have thought that the Russians anyway will be taking precautions against these drones. And we've heard lots of reports now that increasingly Russia's major tool in bringing down drones is electronic warfare. It's jamming of the signals that these drones use in order to find their locations. So anyway, lots of reports about this. We will see what happens. Now, the previous 24 hours have also witnessed another very big missile strike by Russia across Ukraine. And there's been missile attacks on various locations, and they took place both during the day and at night, and they were accompanied by drones. Russian drone and missile attacks are becoming increasingly complex and sophisticated. Multiple types of drones were used, missiles were used. So we had Kalibr missiles launched from the Black Sea. We had Russian KH-101 drones launched by Tupolev-95 strategic bombers from the Caspian Sea. Allegedly, 15 of these bombers were in flight simultaneously. We've heard reports of Kinjal missiles being used. I'm rather skeptical about that claim because I've seen no reports at all from the Russians referring to use of Kinjal missiles. And I think that the Russians only tend to use those Kinjal missiles for specific targets like the Patriot missile systems in Kiev. So I doubt that that is the case either. So anyway, a very, very big Russian attack with drones and missiles taking place right across Ukraine, but one small targeting principally Ukrainian airfields and military installations. And one particular target appears to have been the Ukrainian air base at Starokonstantinov, which is allegedly the location of the Sukhoi 24 fighter jets, or rather I should say they're more like bombers than fighter jets. They don't actually have an air defense role. But anyway, they're Soviet-era bombers, which are the carriers of the West's, of the British-supplied and soon French-supplied Storm Shadow missiles. And anyway, a major attack of this kind. Now, as always, much debate and discussion about how effective this strike was. Ukraine has published figures. They say that 47 missiles were launched in total, but all of them were shot down, save for 13, which presumably hit their targets. Other reports, including a Ukrainian report that I saw, suggested that only 40% of the missiles were shot down. Notice that attacks on military installations, presumably those same military installations, will be precisely the places where Ukraine will have concentrated such air defense assets as it is left with. So these will be more difficult to attack targets. And the fact that these attacks took place and that they took place against defended targets is again, I think, shown by another aspect of the rather complex and sophisticated nature of this particular missile attack, because it seems that these missiles, some of them, changed course during their flight. It looked at one point, for example, as if certain missiles were heading towards Kiev, and then they changed direction and moved towards another town called Zhytomyr. That was one example of this. They don't move in a straight line anymore. They move in all kinds of complex ways. The Uranium-2 drones that typically accompany these attacks do the same thing, and that makes, of course, the attack even more difficult to parry. But the fact that the Russians have to engage in these kind of tactics shows that in this case, at least, in contrast to the attacks on the port installations on the Black Sea that I discussed a short time ago, the Russians were expecting opposition from Ukraine's air defense system. Now, I don't know, and I'm not able to assess myself, how many missiles were shot down, nor about the totality of the damage that was done. Just before I made this video, I saw a report in which Ukraine claimed to have launched Storm Shadow missiles against a bridge linking Kherson region with Crimea, a railway bridge apparently, and this is supposed to have been done by Storm Shadow missiles. And I suspect that obviously this attack might have been planned in advance. It probably was, but it could also be that Ukraine launched this attack in order to show to the Russians that this latest big missile and drone attack that took place over the last couple of hours was less than fully effective, that Ukraine still has some Storm Shadow missiles and still has some operating airfields from which it is able to launch the aircraft, the Sukhoi 24s, that launched these particular missiles. Having said that, I should say that the quantity of Storm Shadow missile launches does appear to have fallen. I believe there's only a finite number of these missiles. I understand that increasingly the Russians are able to shoot these missiles down. Of course, they can't defend every target to the same level. Anyway, my guess is that we're now back to the usual shell game, to the extent that Ukraine has airfields, it's probably trying to move its aircraft around from one airfield to another. Soviet-designed aircraft like the Sukhoi 24 apparently are much better adapted to taking off from damaged airfields than American aircraft, Western aircraft are. So presumably we're in the shell game. But again, ultimately, Russian resources here dwarf those of Ukraine, and that will take time. Eventually, no doubt, they will be able to counter this problem of the storm shadows and all of the rest. Now, whilst I'm on this topic, there's been a whole cluster of articles and pieces about Russian drone production. Last winter, there's a lot of talk about Russian missile production, lots of claims that Russia was about to run out of missiles, which has clearly not been the case. And as far as I can see, Russian missile attacks have actually increased in quantity since the winter, though it's no longer the case that the Russians have been attacking the Ukrainian energy system as they did over the course of the winter. As I've discussed before, the purpose of Russian attacks over the autumn and winter was, yes, to find weaknesses in the energy system, perhaps with the eventual intention of knocking it out. We'll come to that in a moment. But the primary purpose, which appears to have been successfully achieved, was to deplete and degrade Ukraine's Soviet-era, but very advanced air defense system based around the S-300 missile system. And that has been successfully achieved, and it's one of the reasons why the Russian Air Force is now taking a much more active role on the battlefronts. But anyway, coming back to this, to what I was saying, it used to be endless speculation that Russia was about to run out of missiles, that the Russians weren't able to produce missiles because they'd lost access to the necessary components, be it aircraft engines made in Ukraine by the Motor Sich factory, which is, by the way, one of the targets that was attacked in the latest Russian missile strike. But anyway, lots of speculations and talk and rumours of that sort of thing. I notice that's all ended. Now the issue is about Russian drone production. And here it should be said straight away that the Russians did enter the current war at a serious disadvantage in drones. It seems, if anything, that Ukraine had more drones at the start of the conflict than Russia did, partly because Ukraine has had a lot more assistance in building up its drone fleets than, well, obviously Russia has done, but the West, by every measure, has been far in advance of the Russians in drone warfare. At least that was the case until February 2022. But all of the indicators now are that Russian drone production is increasing exponentially, and that it's a long time now since Russia overtook Ukraine, obviously in drone production, but also in the sheer number of drones it's deploying on the battlefronts. I discussed reports in the Western media some weeks ago that Russia is able to bring down 10,000 Ukrainian drones a month. So these are obviously the small surveillance drones that the Russians have been able to counter those drones very successfully. And there's talk about a factory in Tatarstan in Russia being completed, which can churn out 5,000 Geranium-2 drones a year. I suspect the number is probably greater, by the way. These are relatively simple drones. There are some complex subcomponents in the guidance systems, but I would not be surprised if that number can be exceeded. And we're also hearing lots of reports about Russia ramping up production of these suicide drones, the Lancet 2, and the other even more sophisticated suicide drones, which have played such a deadly role on the battlefield. And we hear that numbers of these drones deployed or launched on the battlefields are increasing every day. So at one time it was 25 a day of Lancet drones launched on the Ukrainian battlefields. The number is now said to be more like 50, could be 100 before very long. For all I know, it will be more than that. And Simplicius, the thinker from whom I'm getting all these numbers, goes on to say that the numbers, not only are the numbers of drones increasing, but also their warheads are changing as well. The Russians are developing some suicide drones with thermobaric warheads. Now, that is important because thermobaric warheads, fuel air explosive warheads, if you like, are useful in clearing trenches. It's a horrible thing, but the idea is you launch one of these drones, it creates a fire explosion in a trench. The unfortunate soldiers who get caught up in this, well, one can imagine what the effect on them is. So apparently these drones, these types of drones, are now also appearing in growing numbers, or will be appearing in growing numbers very soon. In fact, Simplicius the thinker has an interesting discussion on his in his latest Satrap, in which he talks about the scale of the Russian build-up, the fact that the Russians aim to have recruited another 400,000 men into their contract military by the end of the year, as I discussed in one of my recent videos. They've now got past halfway into that total. 231,000 men have enlisted, according to Medvedev, and maybe another, as I said, the total will be 400,000 by the end of this year. And Simplicius the thinker says that even with Ukraine now apparently talking about a general mobilization, recruiting, in other words, or enlisting as many males, Ukrainian males, as is possible, that increase in the Russian military, fully trained Russian military, when all of these 400,000 men are finally recruited, that's going to have an overwhelming effect in terms of numbers on the battlefields. Now, can I say here that the 300,000 man call up in September of last year has clearly changed the whole character of the war. It means that the Russian military in Ukraine, which had up to that point been heavily outnumbered by Ukraine's military, is no longer outnumbered to any significant extent. And this is the single most important reason why Ukraine has not been able to make progress in this offensive. It goes beyond the fortifications. It is the increase in Russian numbers. But of course, if all of these contract troops are going to be joining the battle, they need obviously large amounts of training to get them ready, and training can take a long time, sometimes up to a year. But the point is, if those 300,000 reservists were enough to change the dynamic of the war to the extent that they have done, well, 400,000 men on top of that is going to change that dynamic even further. We will be looking at some point in 2024 at around 1 million troops, Russian troops, operating in Ukraine. And it's very difficult indeed to see how the Ukrainian military can counter that in any effective way. So that's what I wanted to say on that particular issue. Simplikis, the thinker, goes into great detail about this. He also discusses the various rumours that are floating around about what the Russians might do. General Kriponos, former Ukrainian general, is talking about how the Russians might decide to launch another attack soon to capture Kiev. There's been lots of talk about this at various times. There's endless rumours about another Russian attack on Kiev. For all I know, that might come. But anyway, that there is a major Russian build-up underway that's incremental and steady, that it involves increases in output of military equipment, of tanks, machines, drones, all of those sort of things, that Ukraine's own military is weakening even as the Russian military is growing in strength. Well, I don't think that anybody who is looking at the situation objectively can realistically dispute that anymore. It seems to me that it's most unlikely that this can be seriously challenged. The Western media is full of stories now about the extent of Ukraine's enormous losses, the facts about Ukraine's material losses are not really open to challenge. And of course, in the West, they don't report the Russian build-up to any degree. You still see claims from time to time that Russia has no reserves. I don't know where that particular piece of mythology has come from, but Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary, he's still Defence Secretary, even though he's due to leave the scene, quit the scene sometime in September. He still harps on about this. But I don't really see how one can talk about that given the Russian manpower build-ups. So one way or the other, it seems to me that the Russian military are going to, at some point, achieve an overwhelming advantage, probably next year, perhaps even at some point this year. I'm not going to try and guess when, in manpower and material over Ukraine, which Ukraine cannot counter. And all of this without taking into account other things that the Russians might do. It's been a fascinating thread, discussion between an anonymous Ukrainian colonel and a Western journalist. You can find all the details, again, on Simplikis the Thinker's CERTAP, but he also, by the way, provides a link to the original. We learned that the Russian missile attacks on Ukraine's energy system last year, this was a time when the Ukrainian air defense system was operating at full force, and when the Ukrainians were claiming to have shot down 90 missiles that the Russians were launching at any one time. We learned that in December of last year, enough of these missiles were getting through, indeed, many more of those missiles than the Ukrainians undoubtedly were admitting to. Enough of these missiles were getting through and were doing enough damage to Ukraine's energy system that Ukraine actually gave serious thought in December of last year to evacuating Kiev entirely, to evacuating 2.5 million people from Kiev. I remember discussing it at the time and asking whether governments in the West had any plan to deal with that situation, given that the only place that those people could go to realistically was to the West, to Eastern Europe. I remember discussing that then. Apparently we came within days of an announcement being made to do that very thing. In effect, in the event, it didn't quite happen because, as I've discussed, Russian plan at that time was not to knock out the energy system, but to deplete Ukraine's air defense system. Ukraine's air defense system is in a much weaker situation this year. It's got this hopscotch of weapons from the West, Iris-Ts and NASAMs, a couple of Hawk systems left over from the Cold War, alongside some Patriot missile systems. The Russians, of course, claim that they've been able to destroy some of these systems. The West and Ukraine deny all of that, though the Pentagon did admit, fact which most people overlook, that one Patriot system was damaged. They've never provided us with details of that damage. But anyway, over the course of this discussion, this Ukrainian military officer, talking to that Western journalist, simply conceded that even with a fully operating Patriot missile system, there are simply not enough Patriot missiles in the world to counter a Russian missile offensive on the scale of the one that was launched last in the winter of last year and at the start of this year. So long before what happened last year, Ukraine will simply run out of missiles. The United States doesn't have huge stocks of missiles. Demand for Patriot missile systems from around the world is enormous. Demand for Patriot missile systems is needed in the Pacific, where they form part of the centerpiece of US defense strategies there. And the officials who run Ukraine's energy system have admitted that the damage that was done to it over the course of the Russian offensive last winter has left it weakened, the energy system itself weakened, and that it would be less likely, significantly less likely to withstand more strikes on that sort of scale. So, as I said, there's rumours, talk about a Russian offensive. General Kriponos is talking about one on the Ukrainian side. Yuri Podolyaka, the commentator, is talking about it also from the Russian side. The Russians seem to be pushing gently towards Kupiansk. Hanam Aliar, Ukraine's deputy defense minister, has admitted that Ukrainian troops in the north are tired, and drones and missiles and tanks and all of those things are increasing in number in Russia all the time. And a Russian offensive, if it comes, and if it's combined with a massive missile offensive of the sort that we saw last winter, and which did not happen, by the way, in February and March of 2022, when the Russians first moved their army into Ukraine. Well, this time the situation could be different. And perhaps the Ukrainians are beginning to sense this. Zelensky apparently has told Ukraine's diplomatic corps that he is seriously worried that as the situation deteriorates and as the United States itself moves into its election season, pressure on Ukraine to seek an unwanted diplomatic compromise might start to increase. Anyway, we will see whether that happens. Now, that brings me back to this conference in Jeddah, which has now ended, and there's been no announcements, except we've heard reports that there were agreements to set up working parties. And interestingly enough, these working parties appear to be looking at lots of different things, food security amongst them, which perhaps don't quite all correlate together with a solution to the war in Ukraine. Much discussion about the UN Charter and abiding by the terms of the UN Charter and those kind of things. But anyway, talks. There's said to be the West is looking for a meeting of heads of state or heads of government at some point coming out of this group, which would include, by the way, Modi and Xi Jinping. But Western official has admitted that this is all in the air, so might not come at all. And I noticed that Li Hui, who is the Chinese official who attended, the mediator, he admitted that there were many disagreements. And Ryabkov, who is the deputy Russian foreign minister, he says that he's been assured that the BRICS states which attended this meeting, China, India, and I believe South Africa, will be briefing the Russians fully about what was discussed at this meeting. I get the sense that the Russians are not particularly concerned about the Jeddah conference. They don't take it especially seriously, and I think that they feel that this discussion that took place in Jeddah, well, they've seen it through. As I said already, what, in my opinion, the purpose of the Jeddah meeting, as originally envisaged, was it was intended to increase diplomatic pressure on the Russians in conjunction with Ukrainian successes in the counteroffensive. Ukraine has not achieved those successes in the counteroffensive, so the Jeddah conference took place in a very quiet atmosphere, as I said, simply talk about talks. Well, we will see. I think in the end, if there is going to be a diplomatic compromise, it will have to take place in negotiations between Russia and the United States. I can't see any other route forward, actually. I don't think the European Union is in any position any longer to pursue negotiations. I think that Putin and the Russians have decided that after the experience of the Minsk agreements, the EU is no longer able to guarantee or to see through negotiations in any effective way, that it will always ultimately be put in a position where if the United States dislikes an agreement that it has reached, the United States will simply wreck it. And I think the present government in Kiev has not only ruled out negotiations, but I think it would find it impossible to conduct negotiations itself. So my own personal view is that if there are going to be negotiations, they would have to be conducted between Russia and the United States. And as I've discussed previously, some attempt to prepare the ground for such negotiations is indeed underway. There was that meeting between Lavrov and the people from the Council of Foreign Relations in April in New York. there's been that Moscow Times article detailing all these private discussions that are taking place between Russian officials and US ex-diplomats in Moscow. I've already said that, in my opinion, the point about that Moscow Times article was that the Americans are not yet prepared to make the conceptual journey to understand the kind of concessions that the Russians would insist upon, both in connection with Ukraine and with the general security situation in Europe, for a breakthrough in the negotiations to take place, that the American participants in these discussions are becoming deeply frustrated, and that they tried to publish this article in this hole-of-the-corner way in Moscow Times in order to try to persuade the Russians that, yes, they are genuinely in earnest about the talks that they are trying to undertake, and that these ideas that they're floating about new referendums in the 4 regions and all of those things ought to be taken seriously. But clearly, those talks are not going anywhere, and the ex-diplomat who was participating in them admitted to the Moscow Times that the Americans feel that the talks are at an impasse. And in the meantime, there's been more news on the economic front where Russia is concerned. Now, I've been talking about the fact that Russia is looking at growth this year. This now seems to be the gathering consensus, not just in Russia, but across, even in the Western economics community, at least that part of it which retains its connections to reality. The IMF has now upgraded its projections for Russian growth this year to, I believe, 1.5%. The Russians say it will be more than 2%. We shall see. But anyway, Russia is back growing. My colleague Alex Christoforou, who's just been to Russia and with whom I'm going to discuss in more detail the state of the Russian economy, what he found there. Anyway, he tells me that he found a buoyant economic situation in Russia whilst he was there, and that is consistent with everything that I'm hearing, and not just from the 2 capital cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, but from right across Russia, from every part of it. And in the meantime, the World Bank has now updated its estimates of the top economies, and it's placed Russia ahead of Germany. It's placed Russia as the 5th biggest economy, ahead of Germany on a purchasing power parity basis. Now, can I say that purchasing power parity is definitely a better guide to understanding the size of economies than nominal GDP, which simply takes the currency of a particular country and converts it into dollars and compares the dollar value of economies based on that basis, ultimately with the economy of the United States. Now, if you take that approach with the ruble, always consistently undervalued, with a ruble in Russia buying far more things than its current exchange rate against the dollar might lead you to think. Well, if you do that, you're going to get your understanding of the size of the Russian economy seriously wrong. Now, Germany and Russia have been basically tied at 5th or 6th for many years now. And sometimes Germany is ahead, more often Germany is ahead of Russia on purchasing power parity basis. Purchasing power parities, you try to look at what the currencies actually buy within the country whose economy you're measuring. You don't waste your time with exchange rates, and it's a more sophisticated calculation. And it does help you get a better sense of the true size of an economy than nominal GDP does. Anyway, based on purchasing power parity, as I said, Germany and Russia have been basically tied for quite a long time. The latest World Bank figures are for 2022, and of course, in 2022, oil and gas prices were buoyant, and I suspect that might have goosed up a bit Russian GDP numbers on a purchasing power parity basis, and might explain why Russia decisively overtook Germany and became fifth instead of sixth, as it has more often been. Now, oil prices have been lower this year, and it might be that this has reversed itself. But I'm going to make a number of observations, putting aside what the World Bank is calculating. Russia's economy this year is growing. Germany's economy is stagnant or even contracting. Germany's economy is going through a process of deindustrialization, as even German industrialists are now admitting. Russia's economy is showing strong expansion in its industrial and manufacturing sector. There was a meeting with members of the government, which Putin attended, which specifically looked at the state of Russian industry, and we see double-digit expansion in several sectors. So even if oil price movements mean that this year Russia's sixth again and Germany is fifth on purchasing power parity, the reality is that Russia's economy, by any objective measure, is going to be bigger relative to Germany's this year than it was last. So just bear that in mind. These are statistics, and statistics should be treated with great care. Now, the reality is, and I've been discussing this for years, and here again I regret the loss of my dear friend John Hellervig, who used to write extensively about Russian economic affairs, but never mind. But who had that granular detail which he could use to discuss all of this in ways that I cannot do. But the reality is that the Russian economy is anyway much bigger than Germany's. I say that. I've been to Germany many times. I know Germany well. I know Russia many times. I used to go to Russia many times. Haven't been there for many years, some years now. But the point I want to make is that on any single measure, manufacturing, industrial activity, overall output of the economy, the Russian economy is bigger. It is not as efficient, or has not been as efficient, as the German economy is. But consider the kind of things it is able to do. It has a space system. It can build and produce fighter jets, advanced fighter jets. It can produce vast numbers of tanks. It can equip whole armies. It can, at the same time as it's doing all of these things, it can bring inflation under control and even reduce it. It can keep its finances in order and in balance. If Germany were to try to do the kind of things that Russia does, explore the Arctic, develop the North Sea corridor. If Germany tried to do that, the German economy would very, very quickly run out of resources and become overstressed. Now, that's not just my view. As I said, I've discussed this with several people, John Hellervik being one of them, both of whom, people who know both Germany and Russia. And that is the reality. But anyway, put all that aside, you might not agree with me on this. The fact of the matter is that the Russians have a growing economy. They are now, as of the World Bank's estimate, the biggest economy in Europe, if you want to treat Russia as a European economy. And that economy is going to grow bigger this year, even whilst the European economies, including Germany's, will probably contract this year. And it is likely that the contraction of the European economies will get bigger next year, whereas the Russians themselves predict that they will have more growth next year. So the Russians, looking at the situation, they must feel the time is working in their favour. Their economy is growing, their military is growing, Ukraine's is weakening, Europe's economy is contracting. The United States has been able to keep its economy growing, but it's only doing that by running ever bigger budget deficits and by very high spending and by increasing debt. And there will always be a question mark about how sustainable that is. So the Russians are under no pressure to make concessions. And pinprick attacks on merchant ships in the Black Sea is not going to change them in thinking in that way. It's going to harden their resolve to see this thing through. If there is going to be a diplomatic process, then people in the West, governments in the West, and I mean that specifically about the United States, need to internalize that fact and to start moving towards a situation where they take Russian demands based on legitimate Russian security interests, which the West has ignored up to now. It's got to take them seriously. Does that understanding, that comprehension exist in the United States? I see no evidence that it does. Even people who advocate some kind of diplomatic outreach to the Russians, when you read what they say, it's still clear that they don't really take the Russians entirely seriously. They still think that they're dealing with some kind of Byzantine Khanate, not a real country, not a real government. And they still seem to think that at some level they can bully or bribe or pressure the Russians to change course. And if pinprick attacks on Russian tankers are a guide, then presumably they think that these minor moves will achieve it. They won't. And so long as the West continues to think in this way about Russia, they will get everything about this conflict wrong. Anyway, that's where I'm ending this program today. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop, where you will find all the great things that we sell there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me today. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day and see you again.